session, the tea break. Take your seats, please.
Good morning. So I thought we'd go over some of the trends that we've been seeing, both in the way enterprises are looking at technology and in the way that they're looking at you. I don't aim to try and tell you how to sell better. I think the aim that I have is to put forward certain facts that could help you to connect with enterprises better. And for the sake of this conversation, I have kind of shrunk the definition of enterprise. Yeah. So normally IDG looks at enterprises which go all the way from maybe 50 crore annual revenue every year all the way to 150,000 crore Indian oil. I have shrunk that. The data I'm presenting, the trends I'm presenting come from organizations that are in the 50 crore to 2,000 crore annual revenue bracket, which is mid-market, which I am assuming is far more relevant for you guys at this stage. Correct me if I'm wrong. I see a lot of people nodding, so I think I'm correct. Let's get started. So one of the things, this isn't rocket science. The slowdown has had impact, and it did have impact on organizations all of last year. The interesting thing is, when we turn around to organizations and ask their IT heads and their GMs and their CIOs, do you think it's going to have an impact this year as well? Sure, they agree, but that number is actually half. 15% or so say that the economic slowdown or what we've been going through is actually a causative factor towards their own growth this year. Does that mean this is not going to be a challenging year? Absolutely not. This is an extremely challenging year. But it's challenging for all kinds of other reasons. It's challenging from the kind of workers who are joining their workforce, the kind of youth they have, the way they're looking at technology. It's challenging from the way that the kinds of technology that's available now and the kind of difference it's making to them. So one of those things, and I'm going to be talking about three extremely strong trends we are seeing from a technology perspective and how they are driving the fourth. Now, one of those things is something that we've been hearing about for many, many years, and it's basically the cloud. And I think finally there's a lot of sun shining through that. There is a lot of value that's accruing. There are organizations that are doing interesting things with it. Now, remember I told you 15% said that the slowdown in the economy would impact that role? Over double that number say that it's actually the cloud that's impacting their role most. Now, as you know, 2 or 3 versions and varieties of this. There is something that's known as the private cloud. Not really a true cloud at the sense, because it still remains rigid. It's not extremely elastic. You cannot provision for endless amounts of demand or for even taking care of seasonal or monthly peaks. But it's there. Virtualization is its backbone. It's getting there very strongly, and it's getting very strong even with mid-sized organizations, not just with the larger ones. Obviously, this is something about scale, it's about efficiency, and interestingly, organizations are now starting to see lower TCO come out of doing this. So one of the huge drivers is that it's becoming very cost-effective to do so. But it's not always a rosy story. There are issues. How do you integrate whatever legacy that you already have? The fact that doing this does involve some amount of capex. It does involve some amount of tinkering with the hardware, with storage, with networks and networking. That's an issue. How can you make this more seamless and painless from them? That's I think, a huge opportunity for you. We're also seeing a huge amount of skill set shortage here. Skill sets in how organizations can architect for the cloud and how they can build frameworks and governance models for the cloud. And we are fairly clear that enterprises, frankly of all sizes and shapes, currently don't have a clue how to do this well. And that's something they're going to lean on people like you. And I'll come to that in a little while later as to why that's really happening. Now, there is the public cloud, and it comes with lots of interesting things. There's cost variability, which is becoming increasingly interesting for CFOs to talk about. But when we ask enterprises, almost the first 5 or 6 issues that they come up with deal with security, confidentiality of customer data, confidentiality of internal data, and of course, what happens if I put my data onto the cloud with one service provider and that service, and I seem to have an issue with that service provider, I want to move out, what shape and form do I get that data in? So it's not all there right now. The private cloud is a far stronger push right now that we see. The other thing that we are starting to see, even in smaller organizations, in fact, especially in organizations that did not have a legacy, is pushing in a lot more analytics. And it's coming from this entire concept that the last 3 years since the slowdown set in has been spent into squeezing more and more efficiencies out of their own system. Now business is starting to start converting that efficiency into effectiveness. Don't really talk about getting and trying to improve the product, but actually talk about making the exact right product and service that would interest a customer of ours. And therefore, I start to see lots of interesting things that are happening out there. One, very, very clearly, there is a huge difference between analytics and intelligence and reports. And a large part of this game still sits in reports, in Excel sheets, as you can see the number out there, right? And Excel sheets are not about intelligence. You can do interesting things with them, but Excel would have shown you that from 2003 to 2008, India was on an extremely fast growth curve, and you extend that curve and we should be doing fantastically well right now. But that's not really the truth, right? So intelligence is all about adding context to it, and you can't do that on a spreadsheet. The other thing that's very interesting is the change that I'm seeing in this. So when we started to ask organizations, okay, you're still doing spreadsheets. What about 2013? Where is the movement happening? Did you know how many of organizations say that they are going to continue to do spreadsheets this year or share intelligence on spreadsheets? 5%. Okay, that's a huge shift. So what are they doing? If they're not sharing it on Excels, where is that migrating to? A lot of it is actually migrating into visual representation of that data. That's dashboards that could show up on your systems. And more importantly, that's dashboards that show up on more smarter devices, particularly for senior executives. We are seeing a huge shift there from 9% to about 48%, and that's happening this year as we talk. There are still issues. 3/4 of BI programs within organizations, big and small, are doomed because of bad data quality. And that's the truth. Even in the biggest organizations, we've seen this. The smaller organizations seem to have a less of a problem because they have a less of a legacy. But that's clearly an area where you guys need to be playing. Unclear ROI, and we're going to talk a little more in detail about what ROI is and what you can take back to organizations. But very clearly, drawing a causative link between investment A and a business outcome B is something that CIOs and IT heads still have a huge problem with. And you guys are best positioned to actually fill that gap. The third is that line item you see there about high talent cost, because it's getting increasingly clear to organizations that BI at the end of the day is just a tool. It's how you interpret that tool and provide the context that really makes the difference. You're starting to already see articles talking about how data science and data scientists are going to be one huge career path for a lot of people. And that's what's happening out there. So that high talent cost is actually coming out of that. These aren't easy people to get hold of. They're typically experts at statistical analysis. They need to have a background in economics. They need to be able to understand multiple variables. So they're not easy to get hold of, and they're expensive people. I wonder whether this might be an area where third-party providers of data science might be of value. The other thing, the third big, huge thing, and I'm sure you can see all of this, is mobility. It's extremely strong, and what we're seeing in shifts is in the way organizations are looking at mobility. So where a lot of it till Look at organizations that started their mobility journey about 4 years back with SMS-based push-pull information coming out of their ERPs or going back in. And most of it was about productivity. Whereas if you really start to look at where it's really shifting, it's moving into a lot of supply chain tracking, it's moving into payments, it's moving into things like video conferencing. Multi-point on smarter devices is huge. It's like magma this year. And if any one of you also pushes VC, that is something I'd suggest that you have a look at. It's definitely moving out of rooms into devices. Now, the holy trinity of mobility within an organization is app development, device management, and converting policies and frameworks into guiding those devices and the data. And these are all areas where enterprises in this country have a huge problem. App dev particularly, most of them struggle to deal with this. So they have only two options. Either you start to develop those skill sets internally, and they're not very good at that. The second is look to people like you, to solution providers who can help them go over this journey with ease. And that's not easy. Mobile app development or mobile app developers aren't easy to get hold of. This is a huge opportunity area for you in case you're interested in going in this direction. And believe me, this is a massive market opening out up there. Now, skilled route is something that plagues all of those things that we have spoken about right now. The cloud, mobility, and analytics. There is a huge dearth of people. Now, one of the reasons for that is the fact that in the first 2 years since the slump set between 2008 and 2010, most enterprises bled talent, particularly of people between 5 to 15 years of experience. Almost 55% of the attrition at that time was in that layer. So that middle layer seems to be missing from a lot of organizations. One of the results that it has had is that organizations are turning more source agnostic. In the sense, I don't think it's so much of an issue now as it was 5 or 6 years back that I will not trust someone who comes from outside my perimeter, or this business about my people, my team knows my systems and processes the best, or I'm a steel industry guy. How can somebody who worked with retail ever understand my pain? Yeah? That's changing extremely rapidly. In fact, we are seeing that it's impossible for organizations big and small not to either outsource or go to the cloud to deliver and source their IT. We find almost no organizations that don't outsource at all or go to third party. Second, two very interesting trends. The number of organizations that outsource just 10 to 20% of their IT is shrinking extremely rapidly. From maybe about 24% last year to about 9% this year. And that's a huge drop. Whereas the number of organizations that's, getting third-party IT for about 30 to 50% of their work has increased at the same time from about 31% to 56%. And that's a huge jump. Now, the total outsourcing 100% layer is still low, primarily because when organizations take that move, it's an extremely strategic move. The due diligence itself takes a lot of time. I know of one organization last year which went over that period. The due diligence lasted 19 months. So it's a long-term process. So we are not seeing so much happening in the total outsourcing area, but just under that layer, the 30 to 50% bracket, huge opportunities are opening up. Now, very clearly, and I know all of you will look at the one right below, which is price. And price is an issue in this country, right? But I think with that is coming commitment to quality and ability to value add. Interestingly, when we start to ask heads of IT in mid-sized organizations, how much do you value somebody that you have worked with in the past? And that actually showed up in this list of about 15 laundry items at number 11. And that's not a very nice thing. Because when we started to drill down, we found that most mid-sized organizations had extremely bad relationships with third-party providers of IT. And that meant that it never translated into business beyond a few cycles, or that never extended beyond the first deal that they struck there. So all of those three trends that I was talking about, cloud, analytics, mobility, is actually leading to this, an acute shortage of talent within organizations, and therefore a need for them to look at solution providers to actually fill in those gaps. Now, just put together a few trends. The way you need to interpret this not so very complex graph is that anything in what looks like lighter brown out there is what they did last year. The darker brown is what they are planning to invest in this year, and the gray areas are exactly that. They're not going to spend. Those are organizations who don't see the way forward. So if you look at things like analytics, you can see the jump is on almost double. You start to look at cloud, again significant. Mobility, absolutely magma. And in all of that, there are things like big data. And the interesting thing is, I think this is moving twofold. A, there is a lot of maturity within organizations saying that, something, big data is not really for me. But please realize, the organizations we are talking about in these slides are not really the large organizations. They are not the Bhartis and the Reliances of the world. These are organizations you deal with every day. They are mid-sized to small enterprises. So why is big data getting interesting for them? Why is it that where 6% of them started to put stuff in, 37% are saying this is an area of interest to us this year? Primarily because the sexy end of big data is predictive analytics and knowing, your consumer better and building products and services that service that consumer better. But at the other end of big data is issues like how you store, very basic issues of how do you store that data? How do you archive it? How do you retrieve it? How do you secure it? How do you build in content management to index data? How do you start to give more structure to unstructured data? At a pop, they have about just under, I think, 50 lakh people that they have borrowed money to. But they're really interested in big data because it's helping them to predict the kind of people that they can service better. It's helping them to actually reduce the cost of the loan that they give out to these people. And so an SKS Microfinance, which isn't which is maybe 1,000 crore outfit, is extremely interested in big data. And it becomes really interesting to them. Any organization that does, for instance, rural procurement or procures from multiple hearts and mandis across India gets very interested in big data because it allows them to centrally procure. It allows them to set procurement numbers which would make sense and make them profitable. Yeah. So big data is becoming extremely interesting. And it's not just about large data sets. So, having given you this, let me turn to something else. We are starting to see a lot of change and transition in the way businesses are working, and a lot of that has to do with the way the slowdown has emerged. A few years back, I could sit and talk to IT heads and CIOs and ask them, are you building your systems for efficiency or are you building them for growth? Because they were a contradiction in terms. You could either be efficient or you could grow. You couldn't do both. And now they're expected to do both. And not just any kind of growth. It has to be profitable growth. Yeah. And therefore, this is the kind of dilemma that all IT heads are running through. In organizations big and small, and especially in mid-sized organizations. They're expected to cut costs and build capabilities. They're expected to execute flawlessly and think strategically. They're expected to look at the larger goals as well as look at small units that they have in the field. Yeah? And therefore, to service this community better, you need to be able to address these issues. And that's not easy all the time. One of the things which is very interesting that's coming out, particularly in mid-sized organizations, and it's getting worse with larger organizations, is that they are spending lesser and lesser time talking to you. They're spending lesser and lesser time talking to service providers. And they're focusing a lot more time on partners and clients, yeah? Because that's what their managements expect them to do. Now, if you look at management priorities, two really stand out. The one right on top, which is about how do you really build for connecting with your consumers. Now, some of those could be about smartphone and tablet apps, but in mid-sized organizations, traditionally, that's just about knowing about how your customers behave. That's about building feedback mechanisms, and it need not be about smartphones and tablets. The interesting thing that I find in this is measuring IT's impact on business performance. Now, that's at 39%. For larger organizations, that number actually shrinks, and that's actually lower down the order. That's about 5th or 6th. For a 10,000 crore outfit, for instance. And that is changing very, very interestingly. I think this is the impact of the slowdown, because the rigor of justification within organizations for IT investments has really increased. And therefore, they are expected to have business outcome-based justification for any kind of investment. At one time, managements were like merchant bankers. They would allocate money in the beginning of the fiscal. It wasn't money in the bank, but you could draw upon it and go ahead and do investments on your IT. Today, managements, particularly in mid-sized organizations, seem to be behaving like venture capitalists. Here is some money, go do something with it, achieve a business outcome, and then come back to me for more. And therefore, which means that even a larger project that might be over a year needs to be sliced down into milestones, which may be 90-day milestones. Achieve the milestone, the next tranche comes. So the smarter IT heads and CIOs are starting to do that, but they need help out there, and I think they need your help. The other thing that's changing is that since the slowdown, and this is counterintuitive, you would expect that IT budgets have shrunk, and therefore they'd be doing fewer and fewer projects. But it's not actually that. The ostensible budgets have shrunk, but the number of projects actually have gone through the roof. On an average, the number of projects since 2008-2009 to today has tripled. So where organizations would do 5 to 8 projects a year, they're actually doing 18 to 20 projects a year. They're doing this, as I said earlier, with fewer people. They are doing this with tighter timelines, because most of these organizations, particularly mid-sized organizations, have a near-time business horizon of less than 6 months. So that's the equation. More and more projects, lesser and lesser time, fewer and fewer people. How are they going to get this achieved unless they turn to you? And unless you are there to provide them the skills and the foresight to guide them through this. But what's happening out here is actually, I'm starting to see at a time when organizations are leaning more and more heavily on third-party providers of IT, on people like you and solution providers, the gears don't seem to be matching all the time. And that leads to unnecessary friction. One, this is one of those things, this is a direct quote from a CIO, by the way. Too much focus on cross-selling products and solutions. And I know when I used to be editor of CRN about 10 years back, I have written about how you guys should be only selling solutions. But today, solution providers are expected not to deliver solutions. You are expected to deliver a business outcome. Therefore, your entire process of attacking an organization isn't just about the solution. It is about what it is going to do for that organization from a business perspective. Is it going to make them more profitable? Is it going to save them cost? Is it going to connect them with their customers better? And that's become extremely important. And therefore, this comes in. So another issue that they're struggling with, particularly mid-sized organizations, is that the people who approach us to help us with this sometimes lacks the tools or the articulation to define the actual business value of this technology. What is it really going to change for this organization? And finally, they're saying a lot of your models of delivering IT are still very people dependent. And therefore, a person or 2 or 3 moves out of your team, and then everything falls apart. And I know attrition is a reality for all of us, whether those are enterprises or it's for you. And therefore, they are saying, start to build systems that aren't as people dependent as in the past. Now, I have another trinity which I'm going to throw at you, and I'm going to leave these as thoughts that maybe you want to look at. One of those is about research. What do you really know about this company, yeah? Do they really need the boxes or the solution stack that you're pushing at them? And does it actually translate into ROI? Now, these are motherhood statements. You could have said this even 10 years back, so what's changed? One of these things, so when we ask organizations, Sure, you say that you want solution providers and SIs to come with homework. What is this homework all about? So we ask them, what are the things that you really want? So they say, you should know about the industry we're in, the vertical that we're in, the business goals that my organization has, the size of the company, what I already have inside my data center or inside my perimeter, and something that they're increasingly becoming curious about. Would you know what my competitor has down the road? Could you find that out for me and let me know X has done that? Then it becomes easier for me to push for that internally. The other thing is relevance, and I'm not sure whether, this is a phenomenon that missed India completely. Now in 1975, there was this guy in the US who started to sell rocks. And you'd assume that, it's a rock, it may or may not be polished. Why on earth would anybody buy anything? Or why on earth would anybody pay anything more than 10-15 rupees for this? Now this was a premium product, and he sold it, as you say, a pet rock. He sold this to people who wanted to have a pet, but didn't want to invest the time and energy in walking a dog. Yeah, so he built a nice little box for it, put little hay in it, put this, gave a manual that came with it, how do you really care? And this thing was an instant success. For the next almost 10 years, this thing sold out of stores. Yeah, and this guy made a lot of money. It was just that he picked on something as a trend that people wanted to have a relationship with something. Now that could be a live animal, which is mostly what happens in a country like India. But he figured that somebody out there wanted to have an association with a rock as well, an inanimate object as well, that you could tell to shut up, that you didn't have to walk, that you didn't have to feed, and the damn thing worked. So what's the moral of the story? Be relevant to the trends out there. Yeah. The other thing is, of course, ROI. And not all of this is direct ROI. It could be just about lower TCO. But very clearly, this needs to be articulated and put in place. So what does this all translate to? They do need partners, okay? Despite whatever happens when you go into one of these organizations and talk to them, they actually need you. They can't live without you at this stage. They don't have the people or the skill sets to deal with what technology is throwing and what management is really throwing at them these days. I have a little equation of how this might work. One, I think you need to really seriously work on credibility and trust. And I don't need to tell you that. That is the cornerstone of any sales, anywhere in any industry. The second is, how do you package it into the right message? And I would really say that you need to lean on some of your principles to help you do that sometimes. Sometimes the right message is about saving someone cost, and sometimes it's about actually helping them to build capabilities to grow. You need to figure out these companies and do your homework even more than you did before. The third, and this is getting interesting, particularly in mid-sized organizations, they want you to have a little skin in the game. Are you willing to do this on a lease basis? Are you willing to, share in the risk a little? Are you willing to tie it down to a business outcome? I will buy this analytics package from you and the associated hardware. Can you guarantee me that my profits will go up 2%, 3%, 5%? And this is an exact conversation that happened 2 months back. I've heard it. Yeah? And I believe that if you have all of this, then you become a partner of potential. Yeah? The other thing is to look at this. So basically, to get those gears to mesh, you need to discover, you need to explore, you need to influence. You need to be able to create a strategy for engaging with these organizations. You need to align the way your delivery mechanisms work currently. And then look at measured outcomes. It is getting increasingly important for these people to measure the outcome of that investment. You need to be in a position to do that too with them. And I think that gets all the gears in place. Partnership works in very interesting ways. And by the way, Prithvi, that is my last slide. So, partnership works in interesting ways. I think this is not just about how do you partner with business. This is sometimes how do you partner with each other to attack a larger business. Some of you may have strengths in data centers and maybe not in security. Can you work together to attack a bigger deal? Can you work with your principals in a much better way to really push this? To give you sometimes those weapons and tools that you require to get some of those really critical deals. Because a lot of that homework is something that you can do yourself, and I'm sure you do some of it, but a lot of that is homework where people like Dell can really add value. I am finished, and that is really my last slide. I think there's hope out there. Somebody asked me earlier in the day how I was seeing the economy and the business movement out there. I think it's moved from first gear to second gear. I think third gear is coming. Not yet happened, but I think it will. Thank you so much.